All right, welcome. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating idea, the belief that God actually speaks directly to people. We're going to break down exactly how this kind of guidance is understood based on the source material we're looking at. So, let's jump right in. Think about it. We all hit those huge crossroads in life, right? Picking a career, finding a partner. Those are massive decisions. It's something everyone goes through. So the big question is, where do you even begin to look for answers?
Well, the material we're digging into today gives one very specific answer to that question. It's coming from a Christian perspective, and it's all about this idea that God communicates directly. Just so we're clear, our job here is simply to explain the concepts as they're laid out in the text.
Okay, so here's the plan. First, we'll tackle the foundational belief that God speaks. Then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of the inner witness versus the inner voice. What's the difference? After that, we'll see it in action with a pretty wild story, look at a couple of other ways this guidance can happen, and then finish up with a really important word of caution that the source itself emphasizes.
All right, section 1, a God who speaks. Let's get right to the heart of it, because literally everything we're about to talk about is built on this one single idea.
And this quote right here, it's basically the foundation for this entire belief system. The key takeaway isn't just that God used to speak, way back when. The idea is that this is happening right now, today. And to back this up, the source points to a whole bunch of examples from the Bible. You've got Ezekiel, Philip, Peter, the list goes on. And in every single one of these stories, the point is that the Spirit wasn't just giving vague feelings. It was giving specific, direct messages. It's all about establishing that pattern of communication.
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. The source doesn't just say, God speaks, and leave it at that. It actually breaks it down into different types of guidance. And you've got to understand this distinction to really get what they're talking about.
So, first up, we have what's called the inner witness. The text says this is the one most people experience. It's not about hearing actual words. Think of it more like a gut feeling, a strong impression, or just this deep down sense that you know what the right thing to do is.
But then you have the voice of the Spirit, and this is described as something totally different. Here, we're talking about actual words, even full sentences that seem to just appear in your mind or your spirit. It's way more direct, way clearer than just a feeling. This chart lays it out perfectly, doesn't it? On the one hand, you've got the inner witness, which is all about impressions and feelings, like a gentle nudge. But on the other side, the voice of the Spirit is about actual words and sentences. It's instructive, it's directive. So, according to the source, they're both communication, yeah, but they're on completely different levels.
Okay, so this all might sound a little abstract. To bring it down to earth, the author shares this really powerful personal story. This is where we get to see what this inner voice actually looks like when it's put into practice.
And just to be clear, the whole idea here is that this inner voice isn't something you hear with your ears. It's a message that comes through, loud and clear, on the inside. So let's see what that meant for the author.
So get this. This is the exact message the author says he received one day while he was praying. Write to Amy and ask her to marry you. That's not exactly a subtle hint, right? And following that advice, it was a huge personal risk.
You really have to understand the context here to get how big a deal this was. First off, he and Amy had never met in person. Plus, he was Indian, she was Malaysian Chinese, so there were cultural differences. And because he was a leader in their community, if this went wrong, it could have been a total disaster, socially speaking. He was truly putting everything on the line, all based on that one inner message.
So, what happened? Well, here's the timeline. He actually wrote the letter that very same day. About 18 months later, they were married. For the author, this story is like the ultimate example of what it means to trust that inner voice and see it lead to something absolutely life-changing.
Now, that story was all about the inner voice, but that's not the only other kind of guidance the source talks about. It actually broadens the lens a bit to look at experiences that are more external or even happen within a group. The text also mentions something much rarer, which it calls an audible voice. This is where someone literally hears a voice with their ears, but nobody else around them does. The classic example given is the story of Samuel from the Bible, who heard his name called so clearly he thought a person was in the room.
And this part is really fascinating. It's this idea of a collective witness, or basically group confirmation. It's laid out as a sort of process for teams to make big decisions. So one person might get a message or a feeling, but before the whole group acts, they wait for others to independently get that same sense of confirmation. Pretty interesting, right?
All right, so we've just gone through all these really dramatic, exciting examples. But right here, the source material takes a sharp turn and puts up a big, flashing stop sign. There's a really critical piece of advice we need to cover.
It's so important to get this next part. This is not presented as some simple, foolproof system. Not at all. The author is actually really insistent on the need for extreme caution and careful discernment.
And here's the reason why. The text is super explicit about this. Not every voice you hear, not every impression you get is from God. It brings in the belief that, well, other spiritual forces can actually imitate that guidance to try and lead people down the wrong path.
So the bottom line is clear. Within this belief system, just hearing a voice or having a strong feeling isn't enough. It's not the end of the process. It has to be tested. The text says you should check it against Scripture and run it by wise people in your community to see if it holds up.
And all of this really leaves us with a much bigger question to think about, doesn't it? When you look at the whole framework laid out in the source material, you see it's all happening right at this intersection between something that's deeply personal, a subjective experience, and the established beliefs of an entire faith community. It really makes you wonder about that relationship, how those two things can, and maybe even have to, work together.